we are back. So thank you for filling out the purpose of QSA data reflection. And we looked at this, and remember this is linked, so if you need to look at that. And this is wonderful. I love that this year we have these data analysis forms that we can look at from these different views, from the city to the building to the street. So I love that they tell you where to find the reports, whether it's Performance Matters or in Light, and the name of the reporting mechanism, and then the data that you can pull and the questions that you're asking. So it's really super helpful as we dive into data. So when you are thinking about what is the purpose of this forum, I'm assuming, and I'm sure many of you said things like, well, to improve, how our students do by identifying areas of weakness, to look at their performance on standards so that we can see what needs to be addressed, what makes small groups, and all of that is awesome and wonderful and what we need to be doing. But what I want to show you today is in language arts in particular, and I think in all subjects, but in language arts, because we're a process content, we're not just content that's factual. It's actually that learning that's ongoing and interlinked with reading, writing, and thinking. It is really important that use whatever data, and in this case, the QSA data, for teacher reflection on the practice. And there's a process that I want to show you that goes with that. So we want teachers, this can happen before they ever get down to the item analysis, when they just see trends in their data. We want them asking questions about their tier 1 instruction. And that's what I want to point out to you, and that's why this is so important. Often we use that QSA data reflection form to go jump right into a tier 2 mindset. And I want us to be really cautious of that. We do need to do that for some kids who really need that extra. However, if we don't have our teachers pause and really question how they were teaching those standards, those essential standards that were assessed, how they were planning for the teaching of those standards, because that could be the issue, and how they're assessing those standards in the classroom. If they're not asking those questions, we will constantly gather data after and have a plan for outside of almost class. So this is to improve tier 1 instruction. So there's questions here you can see, like, did I, plan for my learning? Did a teacher tell? Did I provide a model on reflecting for assessing? Did I pace out my PAs across the units when it made sense? If I did, what did they tell me about mastery? Was I using that data? How do I track progress on the essential standards? How am I collecting the evidence in conferences? How am I collecting it in other sources to get this collection that tells me where students are? Am I allowing students to be owners of their learning, which means goal setting and reflecting on their growth as readers and writers? And on that, there was a really great article down here and that I attached for you about students owning their data. So it's a great resource. Check it out. Then the last piece, once they have reflected on teaching, which involves the actual instruction and the planning and then moving into the assessment phase, then we move into that QSA data reflection that Jacob was talking to you about. This is like the third step in this process. It is icing on the cake. So it's icing on the cake. Notice I said plus, because this is the plus, the icing on the cake. Also, you can use, when you get down to that item analysis, you can use it for student reflection. So I know that a lot of people have different methods for going in and looking at assessment items, and there's tremendous value in that. One of the pieces, though, that we skip often is really having students tell us what was hard for them, instead of us having them analyze to find patterns about what they missed. Instead, when they're looking at the questions or reading the passage or looking back at the passage, asking, what was hard about this for you? Why was it hard? Was it the vocabulary? Circle the words you don't understand or you didn't understand in the passage. Was it that you didn't, set a purpose for reading? They're not going to know what you're talking about as you model that, but you have to show them how it can be hard when something's unfamiliar and how it can be hard when you don't understand what's being asked, and then give them strategies for how to navigate that more complex text. So not only looking at the reflection for patterns, but actually inviting students to reflect on their questions and their confusion and identify the vocab that they had difficulty with is super powerful. I linked down here as well, going back to the teacher reflection piece, more guiding questions for teacher reflection. And I'm going to just show it to you for just a minute because even though there's a zillion questions, you would never just answer all of these, right? This is basically kind of a cheat sheet if you were to facilitate this in thinking through some of these questions. But I'm going to jump down to how did I teach it and go through all these things. And then looking at planning, did I follow this 3-step process? The 3-step process, we call that in elementary. In secondary, you might not have heard that. But it's really looking at the IFD with your 4 PLC questions, then moving into pacing out your performance assessments with your mini lessons on the calendar. And then looking at your previews as well, slideshow, going back into them to get resources or lessons that you would use. And then ending in the 3rd step with the actual day-to-day architecture of a mini lesson or architecture of the workshop. So this breaks it up into those 3 pieces by color coding. So I just want to show you that, and then it moves on to assessments about the how do I assess. This is an area that language arts teachers, if they're in elementary, in primary, they tend to be better at doing, but it's not something that secondary teachers were taught to do in their pre-service. So it's important that we help them ask them. So what does that tell you when you collected that ticket out? You know, what did that tell you about mastery of this standard? Again, in the workshop model, what the students do after the mini lesson and independent reading and applying based on that teacher's exemplar, that is perfect for seeing, did they master that? Did they really understand that? So those are ways to do it. So this is something, again, that we're going to encourage you to and ask that you do at your campus. You know, you might want to start with a grade level or a team, but if we don't get teachers reflecting on how they're planning for teaching, how they're actually teaching, and in this year in particular, when we've been behind, did they ever even get to what was assessed? That's going to be an important question because no wonder they didn't do well if they didn't get to it, if the students didn't do well. And then they have to get to how am I assessing in my classroom and what told me that the kids were mastering. So let me show you an example of what this might look like. This is I pulled from one of our campuses. It's not pretty data because as you know, we've had issues with some of our subpopulations not performing as well as our white population. And in this case, I was looking at Black non-Hispanic students. And in this campus, you can see that this was a junior high, the 7th and 8th grade. You can see that, well, almost 60% over actually, or right at it, no, just over. And then same with 8th grade, are not performing. Did not meet or approaches, which is on the lower half. They're below meets. So you can see this chunk. So let's say this was my class as a teacher. And this is a map projection, a predictor for how they would do on STAR. So this tells me as a teacher, and this is why I love looking at data and using that reflection process. I'm like, wow, how have I been teaching in my lessons, in my unit, those essential standards? Okay, and now how have I been teaching them to my Black, female, and male students in my classroom? What have I been using as my text? Is it something that all students can identify with? Can they see themselves in the text that I'm choosing? Those are questions that need to be asked because we're obviously not reaching that population. So, and then moving on, they can be, okay, how am I planning? Again, looking at those resources. How am I assessing for learning? Does it look different? Is there a way I can assess that would show me mastery that I'm not doing for these students? Do I know these kids? Do I know their stories? Do I know their reading and writing interest? Those are all questions that need to be asked. And just on looking at this, not even knowing the students' names yet, it's super helpful to do something like that. So then let's have this reminder as we're kind of closing this part out that the TRS unit, or units as we keep going, the TRS unit essential standards should drive teaching and assessment. QSAs are aligned to these. So when teachers, as they're moving forward feel like, oh, there's so much I have to do, and it's very overwhelming feeling for sure. That is why we've identified a core of essential standards, that's what we want to see the students master during that TRS unit. So it's really important to set that for your teachers. So looking at assessment info, just some things to remember, and I linked a couple of resources for secondary about Book Love from Penny Kettle and right beside them, because they have some assessment information in here and just some wonderful ideas. But some things we always want to remember is assessment information as we're moving through our units are tied directly to the essential standards that have been identified. We also want to remember that assessment info should provide information on growth. So getting a baseline is crucial. This is why we're saying use iExcel. We have MAP. Now iExcel can continue to give us some data along with your classroom pieces. And then involve the students' reflections and goals in their readers or writers' notebooks. So we want to make sure that our students are reflecting on how they've grown, what do they want to do better in as a reader and writer, what would they like to do, what do they think they're doing well. That's super important. I linked an example of a reader's notebook, and then the notebook is right here. Actually, this is the example. And then on this one, I think it gives you several different examples that I've linked there. And then always, 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 we have to remember, because we're a process content, that reading, writing, and thinking, that our content is grounded in progressions. The lead forward reading snapshot in particular, and the snapshot in general, it really explains this, but the reading one in particular shows that progression in a really great way. Plus, we have resources in Schoology in your reading and writing folder that has the writing progressions in them all the way through junior high. I know we have those for sure. So this is where I'm going to go ahead and have you pause, because I'm going to stop the video, and I want you to go to your Padlet and go ahead and jot down any other reflections about using this teaching for teachers to reflect on their process, on their practice, using that process with your campus teams. What are your questions? What are your comments? What are your connections about using that to really drive home the message and the practice of, we use this to better our craft as teachers in the classroom, first and foremost, before we start going outside for tier 2. Again, we don't ignore the tier 2 piece, but we want to make sure we're shoring up our tier 1 instruction. So go ahead and do that, and I will see you back here momentarily.